Good evening, and welcome to the 28th season of the International Affairs Forum at Northwestern Michigan College. We are so glad you are here. It's really phenomenal to see people here live in the audience. So my name is Jim Bensley, and I'm the director of the International Affairs Forum. This season, as always, we look forward to bringing you important and compelling issues of global concern. So let me welcome those of you here, again, back to this fine auditorium. It's good to see you. It's been really since February 2020 that we were last here, and we had Erliani Abdul Rahman with us, who talked about global human trafficking. Some of you were here then. It just seems like it was forever ago. But it was a great program. We wish that we could have done more, but COVID got in the way. Anyway, I did speak with Erliani this morning, and she is currently pursuing her PhD at Harvard in public health. She's very excited for us to start another season, and she gives us many wishes and again, wishes us much success in the future. So, as you know, this is also our first hybrid presentation. So let me welcome those of you that are tuning in virtually. It's good to have you with us as well. And please know, our in-person guests and all of you online will both have the chance to ask questions of Arwa during the Q&A. For those of you who are tuning in virtually, you're going to use the chat function. And for those of you that are here in the auditorium, you're going to watch for IAF board member Lindsay Dickinson, who will be walking around with a microphone. Now, because of COVID protocol, we can't have you actually asking the question into the microphone. So what you will do is you will tell Lindsay what your question is, and she will repeat that to Arwa, and we'll get that connection made. Okay. Also, we want to ask that all of you here in the auditorium, please silence your cell phones. It's good to say that again, actually. So again, please enjoy the show. Join us for our other events this year and also in the spring. We really look forward to doing this and having you here, actually. So now, let me introduce you to our moderator for the evening, Major General Mike Lehnert, United States Marine Corps, retired. General Lehnert served on active duty for 37 years and retired as a Major General in 2010. He deployed to Japan, the Republic of the Philippines, Cuba, and participated in combat operations in Panama, Kuwait, and Iraq. In 2003, he led 5,000 Marines and sailors during the initial invasion of Iraq. He held 13 separate commands, from platoon leader to Joint Task Force commander. Significant duties included overseeing the turnover of the Panama Canal, working with Cuban and Haitian migrants in Guantanamo, Cuba, as the first Joint Task Force commander in Gitmo after 9/11. Mike has always had an abiding interest in conflict prevention. In 1995, he led the team on the joint staff that wrote the Joint Task Group Commander's Handbook for Peace Operations. It's been reprinted several times and is still in use today. He was also the subject of Karen Greenberg's book, The Least Worst Place. This book is used in military and law schools as a study in ethical decision-making. In 2010, Mike received the National Peacekeeper Award from the National Conflict Resolution Center. Mike currently serves as the Vice Chair of the International Affairs Forum. We're proud to have him with us. Welcome, Mike, and welcome, Arwa.
Well, thanks, Jim, for that introduction. And I would just observe for our online guests who can't see tonight that the in-person crowd is the best looking IAF audience we've had in 19 months. It is my distinct privilege to introduce senior CNN correspondent Arwa Damon. She's linked in from her home in Istanbul. Arwa has been in more conflict zones than most Marines. Perhaps what separates her, though, from many other correspondents is her ability to go deeper into the issue than simply the fight between the combatants. She captures the true cost of war and it is that cost we are going to explore this evening. Her biography is extensive, and I'd recommend that you read it. Our in-house audience has it already, and our online audience will find it on our TCIAF website. And we're also going to give her a chance to talk about herself. That's the best way to find out about a person. So welcome, Arwa. Thank you for joining us so late in the evening.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Jim. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining in. And I do apologize for my rather lackluster background. I was hoping that I would be home, but I'm actually on assignment. You know, I've been covering war pretty much for the bulk of my career since 2003. And when I think back on all of those years, it's a Rolodex of memories, but the ones that really stick out in my mind are what I call freeze frame moments. And they tend not to be moments that are defined by the bombs or the bullets. They are moments where we see these slivers of humanity, moments that often are not necessarily captured by our cameras, but ones that really indicate who people who are caught up in these conflicts truly are. And they're often moments that I wish I could just grab others into, even if it's just for a few seconds, because you have this overwhelming sense that if people could just see this part of war, if people could just see this family, meet this man, woman, child, then surely their perspectives would change. And to share one example of that, in October of 2016, my cameraman, Breslin, and I were embedded with Iraqi Special Forces. And we had been covering the war against ISIS at this stage for months. And this is as the Iraqi forces, backed by US air power, US advisors, and other allies, were trying to recapture territory that ISIS had captured inside Iraq. And this was gearing up for the big Battle of Mosul. And on this one particular morning, this was the first morning that the Iraqi Special Forces were going to be pushing into Mosul. And to make a long story very short, the unit that we were with was ambushed. And they were ambushed at the exact moment when they were in a very narrow road. And a suicide car bomber came and took out the rear vehicle and effectively blocked the rear exit. The road was very narrow, not enough room to turn a vehicle around in any ways. And then a lot of, artillery was being fired, RPGs. The front vehicle goes up in this huge ball of flames. And so the unit was effectively pinned down, along with obviously us with them. Our vehicle ended up taking a direct hit. We go spilling out of it and end up in the courtyard of this home, a residential home. And keep in mind that during the battles against ISIS, every single home, just about every single home, had a civilian family living in it. ISIS was taking them all hostage and not allowing them to leave their homes. And so we go spilling into this small courtyard. And the way that Iraqi homes are set up, especially in this part of Mosul, is that you have the courtyard and then the house kind of rings itself around it. And so in the courtyard, you have, injured soldiers who are bleeding out into the courtyard. You have the sounds of war all around us. You have the women and children of the family inside one of these rooms in the very back corner, kind of crouched behind a bed, so that when we stuck our head into that room, all we could see was just the whites of their eyes. And in the middle of all of this madness, the head of the household comes out and offers us and the soldiers fried eggs, because at the end of the day, we were his guests, no matter the circumstances. And this was his way of preserving his dignity. He had to offer guests at least something, even if it was just fried eggs, and even if it was the last little bit of food that he had. And that's what I remember. I remember that kindness. I remember that sort of compassion. Now, you'll have read this in my bio, or if not, I'll just summarize it for you. But I am half Syrian, half American. My mom is from Syria. My dad is from the US. And I grew up in a very cross-cultural household, one foot in the East, one foot in the West. I grew up bilingual. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do with myself or with my life. I have a degree in biology and in French, a minor in international affairs. And during 9/11, I was actually working in New York for a Turkish textile company, which is basically a fancy way of saying that I sold bathrobes and towels, and not a lot to do with journalism right now. But I was there when 9/11 happened. And I remember seeing the Twin Towers collapse. I remember seeing the US military on the streets of New York. And I remember the lines of citizens waiting to donate blood to help wherever they can. But what I also remember is how this East-West divide was really growing, this, US Muslim divide, US Arab divide. And, friends of mine who were of different backgrounds were getting harassed. They had the police called on them, and I was largely spared all of that because, let's face it, I look very American. But I also am just as Arab as I am American, and that is what really propelled me to start wanting to go into journalism, because I'd also realized throughout my years in the United States, because I'd grown up mostly overseas in Morocco and Turkey and went back to the US for college, that when I spoke about things that were happening overseas and in the Middle East, people had a tendency to listen. And I had a feeling that maybe that was because I didn't look that foreign, even though I was talking about foreign things. And so I decided that I was going to go to Iraq. At this point, the US was gearing up for war in Iraq. And I was going to try to explain people to each other. And journalism has changed a lot since then. And it's been, quite a journey for the industry. And it's been quite a journey when it comes to the sort of impact that we as journalists do end up being able to have. And covering Iraq and Syria, and the later conflicts, whether it's, Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan, you do end up realizing and learning a very bitter lesson. And that is that sometimes, despite the best efforts at reporting conflict, there are often bigger political powers at play that negate the lives of the innocent. And we're often asked, why do we go back? Why do we keep going back into these conflict zones, years after the media spotlight has moved on, once it seems like the outcome has become apparent? And for a lot of us, it's actually quite simple. We go back because we will not give in to apathy or indifference and allow that to demoralize us into silence, because eventually the dust will settle. And when the dust settles, there will be a record, and it will be a record that cannot, and one that we should not allow to be altered by the so-called victors, if there can ever be such a thing in a war, and that is in any war. And so I would like to now share with you a clip from a reporting trip I did into Syria just before COVID began to spread, that highlights the challenges of reporting from war zones, but also, more importantly, the human cost of it. And if we could play that clip now, please.
We have made multiple trips into Idlib province, none like this. Roads throughout the province are clogged with the traffic of those on the run. Unending waves. Many have been displaced multiple times before, but this time it's different. They feel like no matter what they do, they won't be able to outrun the war. These children walked for 7 hours in the middle of the night to get away from the bombing near their village, but it's not far enough.
They want to leave from here, but they They need to try to figure out transport or something, because if they try to go walk, it would just be impossible.
Down the road, Dima and Batule clutch their stuffed animals for the last time. For theirs is a world where toys are not considered essential. Survival is. They don't cry or complain as they are loaded into the truck. There is a sense of finality, claustrophobia, compounded by the collective misery of those trapped here, with the regime rapidly closing in and emptying out entire areas. One village settled down among these 3rd century ruins 2 weeks ago. A little boy shows us a picture in his father's phone of the bombing overnight.
This is Mohaned, and he's 10, and he said that he was very scared the last night because this entire area, the hillsides all around it, were being bombed.
They almost took off walking in the dark. I would rather die than not be able to protect my children, Saifuddin vows. He used to be the village's elementary school director. His tent is considered a palace by this wretched existence's standards.
2 of his kids have fallen over into the stove. Oh, and her face was burnt.
His children are too young to know anything but war and hardship. Let Trump get a bit angry and send a couple tomahawks, Saifuddin says, half joking. For those here know too well that in the world's view, they are dispensable. The last 9 years have taught them that. Ubaid's tent is perched on a hilltop, away from the countless other makeshift camps. Our conversation is broken up by warnings from an app he has on his phone about where the planes are flying and bombing. His elderly mother lies in the corner. She's been that way ever since they found out that his brother died in a regime prison. And the regime is getting closer.
Yeah, you can hear that. This is his brother who was detained in 2012 when he was part of the protests. And then in 2015 they got notification that he was dead. This is the photograph they got of him dead in prison.
All I have is this photo, just this memory, he says, haunted by his pain. Even if the regime tried to reconcile, it's impossible, he swears. You can't trust them. Nothing in this forsaken place is guaranteed.
You know, this story is replicated across the globe in other conflict areas as well. So what I'd like to ask you, Arwa, is civilians are migrating out of conflict areas as well as regions impacted by climate change at a level unseen since World War II. So what can the world do about these displaced populations? And more to a point, what should the U.S. do?
I think the answer to the question of what can the world do, broadly speaking, is refine our moral compass, or at least create a moral compass, and start to care and start to show compassion and empathy. What we have really been seeing, which I find to be very disturbing, especially over the last decade or so, is this fear of the other, this sense that, we need to turn our backs somehow on these people who are in desperate need and protect ourselves because there's a misguided impression that they somehow would potentially be posing an existential threat, especially when it comes to Western countries. And we saw this really amplified during the Syria crisis with the mass flow of refugees, mostly into Europe, back in 2016. The US right now has really lost a lot of its moral high ground, or the moral high ground that the US liked to think that it had, especially when it comes to dealing with those who are in need. The United States takes in an abysmally low number of refugees and asylum seekers. And I think there needs to be a collective shift in consciousness and a recognition that these countries that are unstable, whether it's because of war or because of climate change, that instability is not going to remain contained to those countries, and it will eventually reach the West. In what form it reaches the West, whether it ends up being because of a mass flow of humanity or other forms, the West will be impacted by it. And we need to recognize that we need to start planning from now to try to mitigate against the consequences of that. You know this better than most, but a lot of our reactions to crises are knee-jerk reactions and are unsustainable. If we really want to combat the impact of climate refugees, then we need to start addressing the core root of climate change. If we really want to stem the flow of economic migrants, we need to address the issues that exist within those countries and not allow for certain governments to be oppressive, to be corrupt, to oppress their population simply because it suits America's national interest to have certain leaders in power. And when it comes to conflict, I think the United States and the rest of us need to recognize that bombs and bullets are not going to bring about peace. There really feels at this stage as if there is an inability to address core issues in the way with which they actually need to be addressed. Planning is short term at best. Humanitarian organizations to this date do not have enough funding to be able to address the humanitarian needs, no matter where it is that they are operating. These are things that can change and that need to change.
So by not addressing the problems with the refugees in particular, the non-combatants, and seeing these young children grow up in these camps, wherever they may find themselves, are we in fact creating the next generation of individuals who would perhaps pose a threat to the West? Are we in fact perpetrating or perpetuating this problem?
I mean, history will tell us yes. The best recruiting breeding ground for all of these terrorist organizations are disenfranchised populations, are youth who feel as if they have no opportunity, no sense of identity. And then comes, organization X, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Boko Haram, who says, look, I can give you a sense of purpose in your life. You're feeling beaten down, you're feeling discriminated against. Well, I can give you an opportunity to fight back somehow, as misguided as that sense of opportunity is. And the sense, broadly speaking, is that if a problem, and by that I mean a population, is somehow shoved off and fenced away, that problem is all of a sudden gone. That is entirely misguided. There's also the sense among, I think, many of us that report from these conflict zones that despite the plethora of reporting and imagery and storytelling that's out there, we're somehow missing touching a nerve with viewers and readers. And, earlier this year, I was on another reporting trip into Syria, and I was overcome with the sense where, I wished world leaders could come in and meet some of these children. Meet this 13-year-old girl, Lehnert, whose father, when she was 3, was blindfolded and detained at a checkpoint in front of her. She was then tossed into a forest and she was found screaming by strangers who brought her to her grandparents, who then took her into their care. But a few years later, she lost her leg when she was playing hide and seek by her front door. And these children don't know what it's like to sleep in a warm bed. I mean, for a decade, and I'm talking specifically about Syria right now, some of these children don't know what it is like to sleep in a warm bed. And when it comes specifically to this child, but also to many others who we met, we asked her, do you imagine a world without war? And she said, no. We said, why not? She stayed silent. And then I asked her, can you imagine a world without war? And she said, no. And so you have this population of, youth, children who are growing up in this environment where all they know is violence and despair and humiliation. If we don't collectively try to show them a counter narrative of what the world can be, if we don't try to show them a world that is not defined by evil and violence, then what chance do they actually have to be able to grow and thrive and be more positive towards the rest of humanity?
Yes. Our part of the clip that we did not show because of time made me think that perhaps the West has grown numb to these things, or can't understand, or can't put themselves in the same position. But for those of you that get a chance and see that entire clip, because it was edited, there's an early part of it that shows a young child freezing to death with his family because they had no way to keep him warm, and he was too small to have enough body heat to survive. That's the kind of situation that Arwa is encountering, and I'm just wondering if somehow or another our inaction isn't because we've become so numb to these events that we're seeing.
That's a very interesting question, and I don't know if it's because it's numbness or apathy or indifference, or the sense that, this is happening over there. Oh, it's really sad and horrible, but it doesn't really impact me. And the problems are so overwhelming that what can I actually do about it? But what we do notice is that there's a lot of attention when a conflict or a crisis arises. And this is something that I've also, thought about a lot myself, because when a crisis happens, whether it's a war or a natural disaster or a climate related event, there is a flood of attention. There is, generally speaking, a flood of assistance. And in that initial time, we do actually see, in many cases, the best of us, the best of humanity. You see the volunteers out trying to get aid and humanitarian assistance and help whichever way they can. You see neighbors reaching out to one another in ways that they perhaps hadn't before. And maybe the question to ask ourselves is, why do we only see that sort of compassionate humanitarian action in the moments after the crisis, and yet it doesn't translate into something bigger? Why is that kindness that we obviously have the ability to exhibit towards one another restricted to the immediate time after a crisis and not something that is carried on longer? And as journalists, I think a lot of us have actually struggled with that, because we do feel a burden of responsibility when people start to turn away from a crisis or a conflict or a war that we're covering. I mean, I remember a few years into the war in Iraq, the feeling being, oh, viewers don't want to hear about Iraq anymore. It's too depressing because the war wasn't going the way that the United States wanted it to go. And that's where, we as journalists need to double down on what it is that we're doing and try to find ways to keep audiences engaged. But at the same time, I do believe that audiences need to recognize that having the ability to turn away is also a privilege. And again, this goes back to reassessing and really thinking about what we want our collective consciousness to be. And I'm sure that with all of your background and your past experiences in the military, you also must have felt that same sense of frustration, if I could toss that question back to you.
Absolutely. I think you know, war and conflict is not nearly as clean and pretty as either the history books would represent them to be, or as quite often nations would like to describe them. I would like to ask you, however, Arwa, because this is a pretty grim talk so far, but if in your and it should be, but in your experience in traveling across the globe, and we'll get to INARA in a minute, but are there organizations out there that are either private or international or national organizations that are getting it right, that maybe just need additional bandwidth or support to make a difference?
There are, there really are. And, take it from the big INGOs that, whose names are familiar to all of us, to the smaller ones on the ground. But what I have actually found the most heartening are these grassroots organizations that grow out of conflict, where it's one person who starts out maybe doing a basic food distribution and then manages to grow that into something bigger, or one woman who decides that she is going to focus her life on empowering young girls, and all of a sudden it grows into something bigger. So there most definitely are these positive moments, these positive organizations, these positive individuals. And yet, and I am sorry because this is very dense, depressing, subject matter, but the saddest thing I feel is that those who make the most positive impact, for some reason, those are the voices that are not amplified. And that's a problem. They're not necessarily the organizations that are sufficiently supported, but they're the ones that people like to point to be able to say, look, but this is happening. And yet we need to figure out a way to amplify the good that is happening, because it all does go back to changing an individual's narrative, changing what it is that balances out their psyche. And look, this from the military. You can't win a war with violence. The military tosses around the phrase of winning over hearts and minds, but that's actually very true. You need to convince a population to believe in a different narrative. And the only way to convince them to believe in a different narrative is to show it to them. And this might seem very basic and maybe even naive and idealistic, but the impact that kindness and compassion can have on an individual, no matter what the age, who has lost everything, who has been kicked down by life, that is not something that should be negated.
You're absolutely right. When we first went into Iraq, we were looked at as saviors, and our troops and our equipment were able to move through a vast majority of Iraq, all the way from the Kuwait border up to Baghdad. And then, unfortunately, a unit, and I won't mention what it was or what service it was, they were told that unless they fired their weapons, they wouldn't get combat action ribbons. Well, you can imagine what happened then. 2 days later, you didn't see women and children in the streets. You saw men shaking their fist at all of us because they made no distinction between that unit that was wrong as wrong could be, and everybody else that was trying to win hearts and minds. And it only takes one organization like that to lose it for everybody.
While we're on the subject of Iraq, and talking about how, the majority Shia population did at the end of the day want to see Saddam Hussein removed from power, there's a big lesson in the fact that, one of the big, more powerful insurgent groups that then emerged in early 2014 was the Mahdi army, that was a Shia militia. And so how is it in less than a year did the Shia population, at least those that subscribed to the Mahdi militia, turn on the US military? What was it? And it really goes down to this core notion of, even though they wanted Saddam Hussein removed from power, they didn't necessarily want to then turn around and be occupied by another power. And it is exactly as you say, war is not black and white. War is not even different shades of gray. It's a tapestry that is multidimensional of so many different colors that are just intertwined into each other. And to try to figure that out and to try to dilute that into basic concepts of this person is good, this person is bad, without understanding, the root cause for those emotions, that is just a disservice to everybody, and one that potentially does lend itself to even more violence.
Um, Obviously, for the audience, just about everybody else in the world, the situation in Afghanistan is foremost in the people's minds, and it points out something you said. We didn't show them a clear, better way. And, we watched the Afghan government collapse in an extraordinarily short period of time. Now we're faced with the problem of both the Afghan people that stay there and, of course, those that leave. So what do you think the future looks like for the Afghans?
Extraordinarily bleak. And I don't necessarily know that it is that we didn't show the Afghans an alternate version of life. I actually think that when it comes to Afghanistan, for a lot of the population that didn't support the Taliban, and I'm talking about your average Afghan, not someone who was part of a corrupt government or anything of that sort, but they actually did see a different way of life. Women were able to go to school, to hold senior positions in government, play sports, which might seem so simple, but to have a country where it's forbidden for girls to play out in the street, for women to partake in sports, to partake in society. Afghanistan, for 20 years following the US and its allies' invasion and removal of the Taliban from power, did have a glimpse into an alternate, different reality, one that did hold more hope and more opportunity than the Taliban regime did. What happened in Afghanistan is that all of that was stolen away from them in a matter of weeks, days that it took for Kabul to fall. And my big concern with Afghanistan moving forward right now is that the US and others are just so eager to wash their hands of what happened there that they will allow this Taliban government to make the most basic, and I'm talking basic, of reforms, and that will be enough for them. Very few Afghans who you talk to actually believe that this is a reformed Taliban. This is a Taliban that is more adept at playing the international community, at playing the United States, and at recognizing that as long as Afghanistan is not a breeding ground for terrorism, as long as threats to US national security don't emerge from Afghanistan itself, this government, this Taliban government, will be able to pretty much get away with anything, because nobody right now on the greater political stage is talking about how to pressure the Taliban government to ensure that women's rights and human rights are upheld. No one is talking about how to help all of the Afghans inside Afghanistan right now as we are talking, who are in hiding, too afraid to leave their homes, either because of direct, indirect, or perceived threats by the Taliban. The main conversation right now is about how to keep Afghans inside Afghanistan.
Okay, I'm going to shift a little bit here because I want to talk about what individuals can do to make the things better. And you've created an organization called INARA. So we'd like to know what it does And I'll ask you also the question, if you think, perhaps as a preamble, do you think it conflicts with the traditional view that journalists should be objective? And in this case, does it matter?
To answer that in a very summarized fashion, I think we have an obligation, a moral obligation to be human. The concept of objectivity is already subjective within itself. And I do not see any conflict of interest between being a journalist and also being a humanitarian. And I co-founded INARA in 2014. We officially launched in 2015 because I had reached a point, especially with the conflict in Syria, where it felt that despite all of our best efforts at reporting what was happening there, despite all of the actual, sacrifices that were being made by Western journalists, colleagues who were killed in the field, and also by the Syrian media activists whose bravery is so extraordinary that they would crawl on their bellies to get footage of a tank firing just to be able to prove to the rest of the world that, yes, the Assad government is firing on peaceful demonstrations. Despite all of this, the needle really wasn't shifting on Syria. No one was willing to, with the US at the forefront of this, take the steps that would be necessary to truly pressure the Assad regime to actually alter its behavior. And so we were watching Syria on this crash collision. And I reached a point where I couldn't just report the news anymore. I had to do more. And, some of you may have realized, by now that, it's a very dark and cynical world that we tend to live in as journalists on the front lines of some of these conflicts. But I also remember seeing the kindness of strangers. And so if you'll allow me to rewind, in 2007, I had done a report on this little boy named Yusuf in Iraq. And he was 5 years old at the time. And he had had unknown masked men pour gasoline on his head and set him on fire while he was playing outside of his house in Baghdad. And to this date, no one knows why he was targeted. It could have been because his father had a very basic menial job with one of the government ministries. It could have been because he lived on a sectarian fault line and they'd been threatening families to move out. And Yusuf's father had gone door to door, NGO to NGO, hospital to hospital, looking for follow-on care for his little boy. And he eventually stumbles on CNN. And so he brings Yusuf into the office for us to do a report on him. And I remember seeing Yusuf in our CNN bureau's kitchen eating rice. And his face was this hardened mask of rivers of thickened scar tissue, to the point where he couldn't open his mouth to actually fit a spoon in. He was having to shove grains of rice one at a time in between his lips. And the only thing we could obviously do was report the story without knowing what the reaction was going to be. And keep in mind that, Iraq, 2007, we're talking Baghdad, 100 unidentified bodies showing up a day in the street, bombings on a regular basis, yet barely making the news. And so we weren't really sure what kind of a reaction this little boy's story would have, and if anyone would step forward to get this family help. And what happened next is literally one of the best moments of my career, because the minute the story goes to air, CNN is flooded with calls of people who want to help. My inbox is about to explode. And to condense, the story, Yusuf and his family eventually end up going to the United States. And I was able to travel with them. They were getting help out in Los Angeles. And I remember going to the beach with Yusuf before one of his first surgeries, and he'd never seen the ocean before. Actually, no one in the family had. And he goes running towards the water, and he's just shrieking and laughing. And I look over to his mom, and his mother is sobbing because she hadn't heard her child laugh in 2 years. Yusuf today wants to study to either be an engineer or a doctor. And his life narrative defining moment has changed because, interestingly, by the time he was 11, 12, when we would ask him about the attack, because I've stayed in touch with the family, we've done follow-up reporting on them, he didn't have his own memory of it anymore. That trauma, to a certain degree, maybe it had been suppressed, but either way, his defining moment was not of the attack itself, but of the kindness and compassion that he saw afterwards. And so moving forward to, 2013, 14, and I'm in this mental vortex of Syria and the journalism not really making a difference, and then remembering what had happened in the past, remembering all of the other children that I've met within the context of the war zones who needed medical attention and weren't able to access it, either because the parents didn't know that medical attention existed or because, for any number of reasons, no organization was providing the specific medical treatment that their child needed. And so why not start an organization that can fill in the gap in access to medical care, whether it's to help parents, navigate their way towards an organization that provides assistance, or where there is one that doesn't exist. We have our own network of doctors that help us out pro bono, that will do surgeries pro bono. We have agreements with hospitals. And to overly simplify it, we can just figure it out for these children and for their families in a medical way, so providing them medical treatment. And now we've just launched our mental health program. And we have one more clip that I would like to play that also has, and I should warn, some of these images are a bit graphic, but this clip focuses on the impact of war on children and then on the impact that INARA is able to have on these children's lives. There are images that are just completely seared into my mind, still photographs almost, mostly of children's faces and of the way that the trauma of everything that they've been through just plays out on them. Most of the time, there are images that are just completely seared into my mind, still photographs almost, mostly of children's faces and of the way that the trauma of everything that they've been through just plays out on them. Most of the time when you come across these children in the war zones, they've just fled the violence. They've just been pulled out from underneath the rubble. They're shocked, they're traumatized. Her name's Maryam, she's 10. And there with her older sister, Inam. They say a mortar hit their house just as they were trying to make a run for it. One of the biggest challenges that we face when reporting on war zones or reporting on refugee crises is taking the intense emotions and experiences that people have gone through and somehow trying to condense that into a news report. And, for myself and for a lot of my colleagues, we're often left with this question of, did we do enough?
The children on the refugee route, their parents have taken such risk to try to get them to what they believe is going to be this better life. They're exhausted. They've spent days and weeks on the road, sleeping out in the open, not knowing how they're going to be getting from one area to another. But at the same time, having actually left the physical war zone behind, you do begin to see little pieces of optimism. Of course, what they don't yet know is just how difficult all of that is going to be.
البنت هاي كانت بسوريا ملكة، هلا اطلع هذا مو منظر بنت، هذا منظر مشردين.
It is heartbreaking to witness such despair, but I've also witnessed the power of kindness, of what it means to receive assistance, be it humanitarian, medical, or other forms of support. And whether it's coming from individuals or from charities that are operating around the world, the power of what's being provided, it's profound. Alleviating hunger, providing shelter, restoring dignity. And then there's what I see through my own charity, INARA, the impact of medical treatment.
حاسه انه في شيء انه مو مزبوط بوجهك، والله حاسه بوجهك انه مو مزبوط.
بس من ولا العمليات حاسستين متحسنه؟
ايه نفسيتها ايه الحمد لله، وحتى صحتها متغيره، هلا بعطيها حليب نوعين، حليب بتشار وحليب ميل.
And what you begin to see, which is just so inspiring in so many ways, is this child's story, this child's psyche that was once so defined by violence and cruelty and evil begin to shift. And when you see that shift, you realize the profound impact that we can have on one another when we do actually reach out and help each other.
Their mother is in tears as she's talking about everything that they went through, but also about what the impact was of seeing her son being treated, seeing people actually stand with them and support them, and how it's given them, the entire family, actually hope again. The most painful thing with seeing children in war zones and on the refugee route, whether it's through my work at CNN or through my charity, INARA, is realizing that that spark inside a child's eye, that innocence, that joy, it's completely deadened. But it's not gone. It's something that can be restored. But it can only be restored when we actually come together. And if we do want to create better opportunities, if we want to be better, then we have to do better by those who need us the most.
Oh, شكرا. Oh.
Our in-house audience and our online audience opportunities to ask one, but I wanted to close with this because I think it's important. You had mentioned that you were born in both the Arab and the U.S. world, that you've had a foot in both of them. So I'm going to take this opportunity to ask you how you would assess the conflict within Muslim societies, the tension between Islamic fundamentalism and more secular Muslims. We've seen recent policies that tended to lump everybody together, all Muslims just together. And what do we need to do to leverage and gain support from law-abiding Muslims who simply want a better life for them and for their families?
It's a really interesting question, and you're spot on. The big issue in all of this is obviously the generalization of it and the inability to sort of recognize Muslims as individuals, and instead the tendency towards branding all of them as, terrorists or people who wish ill on the West. And there's this notion that's really perpetuated by a number of world leaders and others that, they hate us because we have freedom and democracy. Well, no. First of all, the vast majority of Muslims do not hate the West because they have freedom and democracy. And if there is any animosity that is felt towards the United States, that is very much confined to being felt towards US policy vis-a-vis the Muslim world and America's broken promises vis-a-vis the Muslim world and what is perceived to be aggression. Look, it's important to also, say in the context of this conversation that when the US first went to war in Afghanistan following the horror of 9/11, the vast majority of the world stood behind America, including the Muslim world. That was viewed as being, a justified response to what happened, the attacks that Al-Qaeda carried out. But when the US then turned around and set its sights on Iraq and based that on, call it fabricated, call it manipulated evidence, the story changed. It went from being America wanting to wage war on terror, wanting to wage war on the perpetrators of 9/11, to all of a sudden America and its Western allies wanting to wage war on Islam, and more precisely on the Arab world. And so I think, the first thing that we all need to recognize is that like any other population, like any other religion, Muslims are not necessarily uniform in how they view things and how they want to live their lives. And I think a key issue, a challenge that Muslims actually do face is that the voice of the terrorists and the violence that is carried out is so loud that it tends to dominate the narrative. And part of that is the responsibility of the Muslim community to try to put forward more mainstream voices. But part of that is also our responsibility because we also allow those voices of hatred and anger to overtake our own psyche. And so it's a multi-dimensional challenge. We need to take a look at how, we, and I'm talking about the broader, we sort of look at Muslims, but there also does need to be a certain level of introspection within that community as well. But also, the recognition that it is, as diverse, with as many perspectives as any other population around the world really is. And allowing, the hatred, the anger, the fear to dominate psyches and narratives, that's not the way to address each other. And we've all heard these sorts of stories, Muslims not feeling safe or, being spat on or feeling like they're being discriminated against. And on the flip side of it, yes, we've also heard amazing stories of, being welcomed into communities. And I think that there is a burden of responsibility on all of us to try to ensure that the welcomed into communities, the not being discriminated against actions and narratives are the ones that is more dominant. But, really, we're at a stage right now, globally speaking, that I do believe is a collective global moment for humanity. And we either do the right thing and we're able to push our world that we all share together in the right direction, or we keep going down the current path that we're on. And frankly, that scares me.
Well, thank you, Arwa. I could keep talking to you for hours, but I also recognize it's probably about 2 a.m. in the morning in this where you're at right now. But let's give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions as well.
Okay, so the way we're going to do this is to have Lindsay Guy. Lindsay, are you back there? You are over in my right, your left. If anyone has a question from the audience, please raise your hand. She will come and find you. And you can state your question to Lindsay, and she will repeat it over the microphone, and then we'll take some questions from our online viewers.
What's your question, sir?
Yes, President Obama created a coalition against ISIS that was led by General John Allen. To what extent was that focused on issues other than military Was it effective, and does it still exist? And how can it be reinnovated today?
So the question is about a task force created by President Obama to fight ISIS, and wondering if that organization is still in existence. Is it something that has been effective or not?
It depends on how you define effective. Has it been effective in diminishing ISIS's current capabilities? And as you know, the military likes to say, denying them the space to operate freely. I mean, yes, obviously ISIS today controls a lot less territory than it did, 5-6 years ago. Has it been effective in removing the conditions that allowed for the rise and spread of an organization like ISIS? I argue no. Those conditions are still there. Those conditions still exist. And right now, even though ISIS does not control as much territory as it used to, nowhere even close in countries like Iraq and Syria, we are seeing, ISIS beginning to or continuing to expand to other parts of the world, whether it's, in Africa or on the Arabian Peninsula, although they are a bit more diminished there. And now, of course, in Afghanistan, there was that horrific attack on the airport that took place a few weeks ago that was carried out by an entity that calls itself ISIS-K. The big issue I find when it came to the battle against ISIS is that there was once again a lack of post-conflict planning. So what happens when the bombs and the bullets stop flying? What happens to the displaced refugee population? What happens to families that were living under ISIS, willingly or unwillingly, who now have nowhere to go and are being left to languish and rot inside these refugee camps? What has happened to try to eliminate the factors that allowed ISIS to exist? And if you'll just bear with me to significantly condense history, ISIS did not emerge out of nothing. If we just cycle back in Iraq, if we go back to 2014, 2004, and an organization called Tawheed wa Jihad that was being run by Zarqawi, it is very quickly emerging as being one of the main insurgent groups fighting the US military. That organization then allies itself with Al-Qaeda and becomes even more powerful. That organization, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, then is at one point declared defeated by the US, only to go underground and reemerge as what became known as the Islamic State of Iraq. Well, the US military then declared the Islamic State of Iraq largely defeated, pulled out of Iraq, despite warnings from inside and outside the country that it was a bit too soon and that they should not be relying on the government that the Obama administration had chosen to prop up, because it was extremely sectarian and oppressive of the Sunni population. So ISI, the Islamic State of Iraq, goes underground and waits, bides its time, and then manages to reemerge as what became known as ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. This is an organization that is very good at playing the long game and at waiting and biding its time. And unfortunately, the US doesn't tend to play the longer game. And that is something that I think is going to have to shift in American thinking when it tries to overtake these things. But I'm also very interested to hear General Lehnert's thoughts on this one from a military perspective.
Well,
is there competition? Yes, absolutely. In an ideal world, the competition is about trying to get the most, human story out there, or at least trying to best tell what's happening in ways that others can relate to. And again, look, it goes back to what I was saying before. There is a burden of responsibility on all of us. And do I think that journalism has fully lived up to its burden of responsibility? No, I don't. I think we as an industry also need to take a good hard look at ourselves to a certain degree, because whatever it is, and I guess this kind of it's a vague way of answering that question. However, we have built our world and our societies, it is what has brought us to this point. And I don't think it's good enough. And I don't think that a lot of people believe that it is good enough. And so we do need to fundamentally shift in everything that we do, in the way that we interact with each other, in the way that we listen, or sadly, as it is right now, don't listen to one another. We've lost our ability to listen to different perspectives, and it is a lot of noise, and it is a lot of just shouting at each other instead of wanting to actually listen and appreciate where another perspective is coming from and truly trying to understand that. And that is one of the key responsibilities of us as journalists, is understanding, helping others to understand different perspectives. And you know what? Yes, the media can get caught up in a lot of the noise. And again, we also need to evolve and change. We do.
Great. We'll have time for about 2 more questions. I'm going to take another one from online. This is from Karen Siegel. She asks, how would you assess the U.S. government's effectiveness in helping refugees? And do you think more authority should be shifted to private organizations to help them?
I think the U.S. government's effort to help refugees has historically and continues to be abysmal. There is no administration that has sufficiently provided enough assistance to those who are fleeing conflict. Even back in the days of the Iraq War, when it came to trying to get the special immigrant visas for those who had worked alongside the United States, it was extremely challenging. There are still people today in Iraq who have not been granted their asylum status in the US. And now let's look at what happened in Afghanistan. Did the US respond and try to get a number of Afghans who had worked alongside the United States out of the country? Yes, they did. Was it enough of an effort? No, it wasn't. Was it something that should have been better planned for? Yes, it was. And let's move away from those who actually work directly with the United States. Comparatively speaking to other countries around the world, the United States takes in a tiny percentage of refugees compared to the size of the country and the potential resources that the United States would have. That being said, it's not as if any country in the world, and I'm talking about wealthy first world nations, is actually living up to its moral burden of responsibility when it comes to refugee populations.
Thank you. Another one from the audience. As we're doing that, let me just say that there's a lot of both heavy questions, heavy answers, and certainly a truckload of concerns about all that's been happening over there. So I would encourage all of you to tune in to Arwa's, when she's on CNN. She does a great job, as you saw. Next question.
Thank you. Well, they don't invite me to parties for entertainment, that's for sure.
This question is specific to some of the stories you shared about children who are injured and then are receiving medical care. When they're receiving their medical treatment, in a place that's outside of their country or outside of the refugee camp, do they then go back to the refugee camp? How is education provided for, and if at all? And what about children who have more specialized needs?
Those are all really great questions. And actually, so the way that I ended up setting up INARA is that we're registered in the US, so we're 501c3. But right now at the moment, we carry out our medical and mental health program in Lebanon and in Turkey, because what I also saw, keeping in mind that just about everything to do with INARA is based on my firsthand experience in war zones. And so what I did actually see was a number of children prior to my starting INARA who ended up going, say, to the United States, for example. So there is one little boy who was about 11 years old at the time, and his leg had been blown off by a roadside bomb in Iraq, and he was getting help in the US. And he went to New Jersey. He's standing on the boardwalk. He's getting medical assistance. He's eating ice cream. The sky is blue. You know, the seagulls are flying. And then all of a sudden he gets dumped back into Fallujah. And so that did have an extraordinary psychological impact on him, as you can imagine. And that's not to say that children shouldn't be flown out of, you know, war zones for medical assistance. They absolutely should be, but it is also something that at least we at INARA are very conscious of. And so for us, if we're able to provide the medical treatment, which we are right now inside Lebanon and Turkey, at least that transition is a bit less jarring to a certain degree for the child, because there's cultural similarities. It's, you know, it's physical proximity to where it is that they are from, because, you know, yes, you know, you can imagine what it's like to be a child, to go and see the way life should be and then go back to the way your life is. When it comes to access to education in a lot of these camps, again, this is very sort of country specific and how long the camps have been established for, but you do have organizations who do provide an education there. Obviously, it's not quite the same as having, you know, an entire government-backed educational format institution. There were great problems during COVID because it's not like kids in refugee camps have ongoing access to the internet or online learning or tablets inside their tents. So that was very, very challenging for a lot of these children. And when it comes to kids with special needs, this is also an area where a lot of assistance is lacking. I actually recently did a piece on a Down syndrome center inside Idlib. And it was set up by a man who was a pediatric nurse and his wife, and they had about 20 or 30 children who were attending. And a lot of these kids, prior to going into the center and having people who were specialized in addressing their specific needs, had actually lost a lot of the abilities that they had gained, in the sense that a lot of these children were no longer walking. They were no longer talking. They'd lost the ability to feed themselves. But what was beautiful about it was, actually, this was the most heartwarming piece that I've ever shot. And, you know, within weeks of being at the center, these children are able to regain a lot of these skills, and fairly quickly. And so, you know, that's the other issue, is there are a lot of gaps in access to humanitarian assistance. And there is a lot more that needs to be done beyond what is already being done.
Well, we could go on for another couple hours, I'm sure. Arwa, thank you again for your excellent commentary, your discussion with Mike. Mike, thank you for being here and doing a great job actually interviewing Arwa. So she's in the other seat here.
Nice to be on the other end.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
So, and again, I want to encourage all of you to obviously pay attention, watch what's happening in the Middle East, and I could say try and make sense of it, but that's not an easy thing to do sometimes. But we appreciate Arwa's, again, her insight into that. I want to thank all of you that came to the Milliken tonight, and all of you that are actually listening in, tuning in from somewhere outside the college. We're glad you're here. We look forward to doing, obviously, more of these throughout the year, and perhaps even taking our masks off someday. We can only hope. Let me do a quick thanks to a couple folks and a couple entities. Traverse City Community Media, or Traverse Area Community Media, helped a lot with the connections overseas in Turkey, where Arwa is. Thank you to Alex Tank from RAF for all of his work, both in marketing and in the technical side of things, working with the Traverse Area Community Media to help make this a positive experience. And thank you to the NMC students that showed up. We really appreciate that. You will be around probably a lot longer than we will. So some of these concerns, some of these challenges won't necessarily be yours fully to solve, but they'll be a part of what we hope you think of and hope develop solutions for. And thank you to Dana Vandewater. Dana is here with us tonight, and Dana was a former teacher of Arwa's, and she was the one that actually put us in touch with Arwa way back last spring and got this all together. So Dana, thanks for being here, and thanks for your association with Arwa. Okay, remember, our next event is a co-sponsored event with the National Writers Series. That happens next week on September 23rd, where we look at Afghanistan today. Please, again, join us for that virtually. Should be a very interesting conversation, a panel conversation. And then following that, our event in October is looking at the U.S. relations with Russia. Always an interesting concept that we have there. So, thank you again. We look forward to seeing you in the future. Drive safely. Have a nice evening.